first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm quite excited and honored to be here as part of your celebrations. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about some methods and some conditions we encounter, as I encounter as a practitioner, which sometimes I see less reflected upon. Let's just put it that way. So I'm going to begin with a little folk tale. Perhaps many of you might be familiar with it. I hope it's not too dull in the retelling, but one dark night, a woman was searching intently for something in the street. A passerby asked her, "Have you lost something?" "Yes," she said, "I've lost my keys. I've been searching for them everywhere." "Well, where do you think you lost them?" "I don't know, inside the house perhaps." "Then why are you looking for them here?" "Because it is dark in there. I don't have any lamps, and I can see much better here under the lights." Most of architecture, its conception, comprehension, documentation, and dissemination, is conducted in well-lit spaces, where architecture has been, in Corbusier's famous words, the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light. And in these, we have found many precious things. But moving away from the primacy of vision and the compulsion of visibility that we as architects subject ourselves to, and moving into the proverbial indoors of the work of architecture and its practice, into the expressive culture of the intimate, the fragile, the hidden, and the ephemeral, one wonders what might we find. There is a sustained illusion here that the work of architecture be returned to the stuff of life, rather than it be an autonomous art form, that is primarily a visual art form. Not all elements, or even all the structures of everyday life, are always evident, but they become part of our habitus, as conceptualized by Pierre Bourdieu, as part of everyday, the experience of lived practices. And this I'm very interested in the conditions that momentarily reveal the facade, so to speak, of these structures, and the documentation and the occasional disappearance of the context understood as lived practices. So perhaps, again, many of you might be familiar with what this is. It's the Karazas test, for those of you who aren't. This is a test that investigates the relationship between earth, water, and air, and is expressed through a diversity of form, consistency, and texture of the resulting material, as you see in the various grids. My first experience of performing this test was in a workshop on earthen architecture in Austria, and it made quite an impression on me. As a group, it seemed, I seemed to have reflected at the time, that we were unconsciously predisposed to one outcome, which led to the comparisons, the inevitable comparisons of each other's samples, because each one of us was responsible for making one of those samples. And we started comparing each other's samples, even though each sample was unique in terms of the type of soil, quantity of water, the degree of compaction. Tellingly, the perfect samples were deemed ones which held their shape, the very precise, with the greatest degree of precision, because we were all fixated on this as a mold, that is a generator of form, rather than a measure. This tendency of homogenizing outcomes through an innate need for formal benchmarking was despite the fact that, the ignoble-looking slurry is perfect for plaster, for instance, or the sort of goop that we were squishing by our feet, maybe the consistency you need for a brick, or maybe better to work in the summer with a little more moisture, and so on. It seemed our preponderance for ubiquity and the notions of perfection are what makes us forget to truly celebrate diversity for what it is, an expression of context. Further, in many cases, the end result is presented as though it is inevitable. The work of architecture becomes a reduction of an isolated aha moment of inspiration. All of you are familiar with this. To that, all liveness is evened out, flattened, and a formal distancing is established. At this point, I would like to point out that this is not a critique of the outcome, falling water. but how we think about and present the practice of architecture, the mythology of that to that, as though nothing exists in between. The ideation materialized and the documentation as an evidence of that materialization. Critical practice, including its documentation, I would argue, must deal with the specificity and the inclusivity of context and how to make it relevant to the design process. Our work, my work, teaching and practice as well, tries to make the method and experience of that liveness of context knowable. Certain conditions we encounter as architects in our practice of architecture call into question how to record, when to record, and indeed what can be recorded to allow context to emerge. I hope to present such conditions and look at documentation of these as an opportunity for interrogation of the practice of architecture rather than as transparent windows onto the work of architecture, onto the works of architecture, I beg your pardon. So to begin with, there is the condition of meeting. You know, you always begin somewhere, and that's where you meet the site, you meet the project, you meet the clients. How does one document a meeting? Climate, site configuration, the cycles of the sun, the paths of the wind, bylaws, zoning, cultural narratives. It seems as if the complexity of discourse has assumed that a landscape cannot be known unless all the informational elements and narratives have been incorporated, leaving unrecognized the predominant encounter with it, that of the interaction of the physical body within the landscape. These interactions are the beginnings of familiarity, in that they need our presence. A mode of engagement which allows us to begin not with a literate reading of space, but with the physical acuity and the specificity that accompanies inserting oneself into an environment. Through one's body, one explores the built environment not only through one's eyes, but up close, making the work deeply personal. Two examples. One, a precursor to design. This slide is from a workshop we did last year at the Archipri, a workshop with international architecture students visiting the city of Ahmedabad for the first time. Here, the inhabitation of the city was through the practice of play. No cameras, recorders, sketchbooks, or measure tapes were allowed. Play here refers to very material games played by the participants, adaptations of forms they might have been familiar with, whether it was soccer, whether it was cricket, whether it was, I Spy. And play was a stimulus to experiencing the city, not as an observed strategy. They weren't there to observe others play. The challenges and risks for the participants experiencing the city for the first time were the pure apprehension, it's pure vulnerability of inserting themselves into an absolutely unknown context. The experiences were brought back into the workshop venue, which was the SEPT campus, through oral tellings. Again, we stayed away from the visual for some time. And these were responses to a few questions, mainly to do with how the city opened up to them while they were playing games. First in their native languages, and then through self-translations. These were recorded. And this being a workshop with architecture students, the culmination was in the participants housing their tellings within an environment that evoked the significant qualities of their tellings and their experiences. The second is a precursor for construction. Oftentimes, construction sites become places of meeting, the building culture of a region. Not some romanticized regional notion, though, because both labor and craft, especially in projects I engage with, which are always seem to be at the periphery of things, there, both labor and craft is a fluid context. It's transient, whether it's migrant labor, whether it's places that are not quite town, not quite city. So for each set of drawings and specifications, we often find the need for a tactile and material translation. This is an opportunity for knowledge to be embodied as a lived experience. We involve our clients, our site supervisors, and the labor crew all at once. These on-site workshops become ways to experience specifications because numbers, like visuals, are abstract, and reviving a feel, a body memory, for materials becomes helpful, and also it is an acknowledgement of the bodies that are going to be present within the construction site and all the hierarchies therein. Which brings us to the next condition that I sort of often like to sort of deliberate upon. And this mainly is a response to the notion of when does a project finish? What do we think about when we say finished? To take the term literally, buildings under construction reveal where they are built. It's a really fascinating thing, the construction site. That is how a construction region most commonly works and builds. More than any formal or aesthetic appropriation of details, motifs, or styles, the peculiarities of ways in which a construction society operates, measures, and monitors itself reveals the building culture of the place. Not merely how it has always been, but also the slow shifts and imports and exchanges, and also its culture of play. So what do I mean by this? This is a construction site in Abydos, Egypt, where we are doing some conservation work. The steel scaffolding that you see is a relatively recent import in the region. It's in the Upper Nile area. Its systems of assembly incorporated within a region which is primarily one of masonry crew, and therefore a very select bunch of laborers, a select crew, handles the scaffolding. The season of 2012 is where this is taken from, ended with the crew responsible for assembling and dismantling the scaffolding during the season, erecting a giant scaffolding by collecting all the scaffolding of the site from various locations. The challenge, I assume, was to go as tall as possible without a collapse. This was not required, mind you. It was free of the service to the actual construction and conservation work. But perhaps it was thought worthwhile to demonstrate a growing confidence or capability, an installation. And a happy consequence was this grand aerial shot at the end of the season in a pre-drone era. Similarly, the occasional flourish of the migrant plaster crew on a school site in Orissa. It is significant that in both these cases, the players themselves know that the play, by its very nature, is transient, and in its practice occupies a liminal space. It's going to be covered up, it's going to be taken down. The in-betweens. In its potential to transcend need, play reveals the possible, but also what already stands as a structure or context. Play is sensed as an equalizer that momentarily removes the construction site's hierarchies and creating ephemeral common grounds. And we think these things are worth documenting and recording. The expectations of what looks and constitutes finished, and the questions of which technologies and products constitute relevance in a particular situation or geography, whether time decays from day one or whether materials are enriched by time. For example, a glossy finish on an office table made of wood, itself a noble material. Often the glossiness doesn't give the opportunity for the scratches to gain value. Or there is the tyranny of our expectation with a material. Here, in this project, for instance, the locally sourced, natural, untreated wood on floors, walls, ceilings, tables, chairs, doors, sills. It was used in the reformation of an old boarding house into an agricultural vocational training building in Altmünster in Austria. It was also the site for the earthen workshop that I had alluded to. Unfinished here was made to behave as though it was glossy, installed not to age. The aesthetic or technical criteria are the ones, it seems, with which we evoke architecture, instead of imagining them as resonant settings and backgrounds for situations of lived life. This is what we were actually doing in it. The buildings and its sustainably sourced materials became completely intolerant to any form of detritus or decay. The ideal condition being that the building continues to work as though it was new, instead of it being about the ability of the built to let time reflect in things, from walk to sidewalks, of how far we can stretch the sense of it still being made in a continuous present. Under construction is also a condition that extends to the culture around maintenance, something, again, I think we never talk about as architects and never even think it can be made a part of our sort of process. A construction and collection of memories, from the everyday rituals of taking care and tinkering to weekend DIY projects, do it yourself, seasonal and annual cycles of renewal. Each of these conditions of under construction are part of the architectural project, we believe, and are an opportunity for complexities to emerge in context rather than attempting to freeze their fluidities insofar as accepted modes and moments of documentation. This brings us to the issue of what can be documented and what of disappearance, given that one of the most recurring definitions of liveness is that it is fundamentally ephemeral. There is a condition within the practice of architecture that toys with this need, our need as architects, for making visible the purity of our ideas and efforts, and that is the renovation project. In most cases, the work dissolves or integrates in a way a transplanted organ must. Both parties, the host and the transplant, are at play here. In the integration, there is a disappearance of the architectural gesture, revealed in the subsequent performance of the reconstructed whole. I might have to sort of... Clearly, I'm not speaking of the glamorous interiors project here, but one where you often get asked, so what did you do exactly? Or worse, is it even architecture? But there is a proximity here, in that one has to deal with the complexities of an existing or found situation head-on. There's no place to hide, really. A renovation takes into account existing conditions, most often in dire conditions, and with an economy of means that may never find its way into lists or metrics of sustainable rating systems. It reconstitutes into a form that works better, performs efficiently, and makes the stitching of the old and new as effortless as possible. The previous set of slides, the one with the butterflies, was a youth arts organization on the urban peripheries of Denver, where it was important to remain in the neighborhood location, and parts of the building structure were in reasonable shape. Therefore, we didn't want to take it down and build something new, so we had to sort of rework the old. This current set of slides was the Egypt project that I talked about. It was a rehabilitation of a 5,000-year-old funerary structure in Abydos, Egypt, where the goal was to preserve the structure as a ruin, with the new material limited to those areas necessary to stabilize existing walls, so that the genesis of the structure and how it changes as things are rubbed out and drawn over, while traces of earlier versions of its history, from early pharaonic kingdom to Coptic refugees to abandonment to Arab raiders, pagan cults, and then scavenging early Egyptologists on quests to find more glamorous burial grounds, continue to be clear. In documentation, what does one exclude? Proper behavior in the work of architecture is often expressed through our unquestioned reverence for silence. Its coupling with light institutes that a building's qualities, and more importantly, its behavior, is best revealed through shadows, subtle textural ones, deep volumetric ones. For light and shadow qualify space and form, express materiality, I'm saying nothing new here, and mark or make visible the passage of time. This is the narrative we grow up with in architecture. Perhaps this is why there is an in-season and an off-season, a right time and a wrong, or at least an unfortunate time to our efforts to document the built environment. We hardly see buildings in moments of monsoons, all damp and heaving with moisture, or don't we feel cheated when we are traveling and we find that where we are traveling to is under renovation and under scaffolding. We try and edit out context we have become intolerant to and treat them as detritus of our times, whether it is the aged or the poopers. Joseph Brodsky writes, "The city of memory is empty because for imagination, it is easy to conjure architecture rather than human beings. Architecture is meaningful, though, only in the interaction and resonance with life, real, remembered, or imagined. This, on the other hand, is how we like to document buildings or campuses. This is the behavior of Sept Campus, for instance, in Ahmedabad, in August of 2012, as documented by a student. Space, its meaning, is created by the interaction of the body and the ground. It is where you make contact with architecture in the most foundational way, and it is in the simplest and most intimate way. The pleasure, the pain, comfort, or revulsion, depending on what meets your feet. The process of creating intimacy, then, is not just a matter of engaging emotions, but engaging the intelligence of the body to register and record and create memories. An architecture working from memory, that's context. And what we have built now becomes part of that context and can no longer exist autonomously. The cycle begins again. We design from what we remember. Inventions do not exist per se in isolation, that aha moment. The connection between what we remember and our own present context, that is fertile ground. I work alongside theater makers and storytellers to create conditions for using the body, to challenge, review, and rethink our built landscapes and the context of architecture. Working this way, using the body to both record and examine, creates moments of being held in place, and at the same time loosens the embeddedness brought about by the familiarity of habit, so that a known place can be looked at anew, its physical characteristics and potentials revealed occasionally, often disregarding representational ones. This, for instance, was a piece of device theater situated in a building I designed, you know, the youth organization with the butterflies, in the Denver area, where along with middle school youth, the main users of this building, the building and the spaces are a major part of the devising work, and each situation, little urban meditations around a theme, is sort of informed by the built condition. The themes we work with for each workshop of inhabitation and investigation is chosen to loosely scaffold the condition of devised plays and is specific to the collaborating organization and the physical site. In the case of this workshop, for instance, the theme chosen was one of belonging, creating an opportunity to investigate a vernacular inclusive for adolescent populations discovering the city structure, for whom much of the experience within urban centers is one of disruption and dislocation. The audience moves from place to place, location to location within the building, and as they move, the production and the environment is constituted. Similarly, this is a work which was situated in a community hospital in their pain management ward. Stories of hope and pain are set into corridors, hallways, exam rooms, and the architecture of the building itself becomes a creative partner to with the participants. The audience experience is similar to the last devised work that we saw. This, on the other hand, was a more scripted work located in the abandoned pool of a public school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Here, letting us and the audience experience the spatiality of a pool, for example, and its topography, which otherwise gets hidden by a surface of water. So we like to investigate built environments in ways other than what we might often be used to. I encountered Tardu through a lecture by Palasma, actually, but the powerful provocation has remained with me. In the context of this event, and especially given that there are so many students here, one wonders if the recording and the registering of context, which obviously all of you must hear again and again, becomes less about representing thought, that is the evidence, and returns in the hands of architects as an act of thinking. Thank you.